This audio case is brought to you by Laudio. South Dakota v. Dole, Supreme Court of the United States, decided June 23, 1987. Chief Justice Rehnquist delivered the opinion of the court. Petitioner South Dakota permits persons 19 years of age or older to purchase beer containing up to 3.2% alcohol. In 1984, Congress enacted 23 U.S.C. Section 158, which directs the Secretary of Transportation to withhold a percentage of federal highway funds otherwise allocable from states in which the purchase or public possession of any alcoholic beverage by a person who is less than 21 years of age is lawful. The states sued in United States District Court seeking a declaratory judgment that Section 158 violates the constitutional limitations on congressional exercise of the spending power and violates the 21st Amendment to the United States Constitution. The District Court rejected the states' claims, and the Court of Appeals for the Eighth Circuit affirmed. In this court, the parties direct most of their efforts to defining the proper scope of the 21st Amendment. Relying on our statement in California Retail Liquor Dealers Association v. Midcal Aluminum, 1980, that the 21st Amendment grants the states virtually complete control over whether to permit importation or sale of liquor and how to structure the liquor distribution system, South Dakota asserts that the setting of minimum drinking age is clearly within the core powers reserved to the states under Section 2 of the amendment. Section 158, petitioner claims, usurps that core power. The Secretary in response asserts that the 21st Amendment is simply not implicated by Section 158. The plain language of Section 2 confirms the state's broad power to impose restrictions on the sale and distribution of alcoholic beverages, but does not confer on them any power to permit sales that Congress seeks to prohibit. That amendment, under this reasoning, would not prevent Congress from affirmatively enacting a national minimum drinking age more restrictive than that provided by the various state laws, and it would follow a fortiori that indirect inducement involved here is compatible with the 21st Amendment. These arguments present questions of the meaning of the 21st Amendment, the bounds of which have escaped precise definition. Despite the extended treatment of the question by the parties, however, we need not decide in this case whether that amendment would prohibit an attempt by Congress to legislate directly a national minimum drinking age. Here, Congress has acted indirectly under its spending power to encourage uniformity in the states' drinking ages. As we explain below, we find this legislative effort within constitutional bounds even if Congress may not regulate drinking ages directly. The Constitution empowers Congress to lay and collect taxes, duties, imposts, and excises to pay the debts and provide for the common defense and general welfare of the United States. Incident to this power, Congress may attach conditions on the receipt of federal funds and has repeatedly employed the power to further broad policy objectives by conditioning receipt of federal monies upon compliance by the recipient with federal statutory and administrative directives. The breadth of this power was made clear in United States v. Butler, 1936, where the court, resolving a long-standing debate over the scope of the spending clause, determined that the power of Congress to authorize expenditure of public monies for public purposes is not limited by the direct grants of legislative power found in the Constitution. Thus, objectives not thought to be within Article I's enumerated legislative fields may nevertheless be attained through the use of the spending power and the conditional grant of federal funds. The spending power is, of course, not unlimited, but is instead subject to several general restrictions articulated in our cases. The first of these limitations is derived from the language of the Constitution itself. The exercise of the spending power must be in pursuit of the general welfare. In considering whether a particular expenditure is intended to serve general public purposes, courts should defer substantially to the judgment of Congress. Second, we have required that if Congress desires to condition the states' receipt of federal funds, it must do so unambiguously, enabling the states to exercise their choice knowingly, cognizant of the consequences of their participation. Third, our cases have suggested, without significant elaboration, that conditions on federal grants might be illegitimate if they are unrelated to the federal interest in particular national projects or programs. Finally, we have noted that other constitutional provisions may provide an independent bar to the conditional grant of federal funds. South Dakota does not seriously claim that Section 158 is inconsistent with any of the first three restrictions mentioned above. We can readily conclude that the provision is designed to serve the general welfare, especially in light of the fact that the concept of welfare, or the opposite, is shaped by Congress. Congress found that the differing drinking ages in the states created a particular incentive for young persons to combine their desire to drink with their ability to drive, and that this interstate problem required a national solution. The means it chose to address this dangerous situation were reasonably calculated to advance the general welfare. The conditions upon which states received the funds, moreover, could not be more clearly stated by Congress. And the state itself, rather than challenging the germaneness of the condition to federal purposes, admits that it has never contended that the congressional action was unrelated to a national concern in the absence of the 21st Amendment. Indeed, the condition imposed by Congress is directly related to one of the main purposes for which highway funds are expended: safe interstate travel. This goal of the interstate highway system had been frustrated by varying drinking ages among the states. A presidential commission appointed to study alcohol-related accidents and fatalities on the nation's highways concluded that the lack of uniformity in the states' drinking ages created an incentive to drink and drive, because young persons commute to border states where the drinking age is lower. By enacting Section 158, Congress conditioned the receipt of federal funds in a way reasonably calculated to address this particular impediment to a purpose for which the funds are expended. The remaining question about the validity of Section 158 and the basic point of disagreement between the parties is whether the 21st Amendment constitutes an independent constitutional bar to the conditional grant of federal funds. Petitioner, relying on its view that the 21st Amendment prohibits direct regulation of drinking ages by Congress, asserts that Congress may not use the spending power to regulate that which it is prohibited from regulating directly under the 21st Amendment. But our cases show that this independent constitutional bar limitation on the spending power is not of the kind petitioner suggests. United States v. Butler, for example, established that the constitutional limitations on Congress when exercising its spending power are less exacting than those on its authority to regulate directly. We have also held that a perceived 10th Amendment limitation on congressional regulation of state affairs did not committently limit the range of conditions legitimately placed on federal grants. In Oklahoma v. Civil Service Commission 1947, the court considered the validity of the Hatch Act insofar as it was applied to political activities of state officials whose employment was financed in whole or in part with federal funds. The state contended that in order under this provision to withhold certain federal funds unless a state official was removed invaded its sovereignty in violation of the 10th Amendment. Though finding that the United States is not concerned with and has no power to regulate local political activities as such of state officials, the court nonetheless held that the federal government does have power to fix the terms upon which its money allotments to states shall be dispersed. The court found no violation of the state's sovereignty because the state could and did adopt the simple expedient of not yielding to what she urges is federal coercion. The offer of benefits to a state by the United States dependent upon cooperation by the state with federal plans, assumedly for the general welfare, is not unusual. See also Stewart Machine Company v. Davis. There is only a condition which the state is free at pleasure to disregard or to fulfill. These cases establish that the independent constitutional bar limitation on the spending power is not, as petitioner suggests, a prohibition on the indirect achievement of objectives which Congress is not empowered to achieve directly. Instead, we think that the language in our earlier opinion stands for the unexceptionable proposition that the power may not be used to induce the states to engage in activities that would themselves be unconstitutional. Thus, for example, a grant of federal funds conditioned on invidiously and discriminatory state action or the infliction of cruel and unusual punishment would be an illegitimate exercise of Congress's broad spending power. But no such claim can be or is made here. Were South Dakota to succumb to the blandishments offered by Congress and raise its drinking age to 21, the state's action in so doing would not violate the constitutional rights of anyone. Our decisions have recognized that in some circumstances the financial inducement offered by Congress might be so coercive as to pass the point at which pressure turns into compulsion. Here, however, Congress has directed only that a state desiring to establish a minimum drinking age lower than 21 lose a relatively small percentage of certain federal highway funds. Petitioner contends that the coercive nature of this program is evident from the degree of success it has achieved. We cannot conclude, however, that a conditional grant of federal money of this sort is unconstitutional simply by reason of its success in achieving the congressional objective. When we consider for a moment that all South Dakota would lose if she adheres to her chosen course as to a suitable minimum drinking age is 5% of the funds otherwise obtainable under specified highway grant programs, the argument as to coercion is shown to be more rhetoric than fact. As we said a half-century ago in Stewart Machine Company v. Davis, every rebate from a tax when conditioned upon conduct is in some measure a temptation. But to hold that motive or temptation is equivalent to coercion is to plunge the law in endless difficulties. The outcome of such a doctrine is the acceptance of a philosophical determinism by which choice becomes impossible. Till now, the law has been guided by a robust common sense, which assumes the freedom of the will as a working hypothesis in the solution of its problems. Here, Congress has offered relatively mild encouragement to the states to enact higher minimum drinking ages than they would otherwise choose. But the enactment of such laws remains the prerogative of the states, not merely in theory, but in fact. Even if Congress might lack the power to impose a national minimum drinking age directly, we conclude that encouragement to state action found in Section 158 is a valid use of the spending power. Accordingly, the judgment of the Court of Appeals is affirmed. Justice Brennan dissenting. I agree with Justice O'Connor that regulation of the minimum age of purchasers of liquor falls squarely within the ambit of those powers reserved to the states by the 21st Amendment. Since states possess this constitutional power, Congress cannot condition a federal grant in a manner that abridges this right. The amendment itself strikes the proper balance between federal and state authority. I, therefore, dissent. Justice O'Connor dissenting. The Court today upholds the National Minimum Drinking Age Amendment as a valid exercise of the spending power conferred by Article 1, Section 8. But Section 158 is not a condition on spending reasonably related to the expenditure of federal funds and cannot be justified on that ground. Rather, it is an attempt to regulate the sale of liquor, an attempt that lies outside Congress's power to regulate commerce because it falls within the ambit of Section 2 of the 21st Amendment. My disagreement with the Court is relatively narrow on the spending power issue. It is a disagreement about the application of a principle rather than a disagreement on the principle itself. I agree with the Court that Congress may attach conditions on the receipt of federal funds to further the federal interest in particular national projects or programs. I also subscribe to the established proposition that the reach of the spending power is not limited by the direct grants of legislative power found in the Constitution. Finally, I agree that there are 4 separate types of limitations on the spending power. The expenditure must be for the general welfare. The conditions imposed must be unambiguous. They must be reasonably related to the purpose of the expenditure. And the legislation may not violate any independent constitutional prohibition. Insofar as 2 of those limitations are concerned, the Court is clearly correct that Section 158 is wholly unobjectionable. Establishment of a national minimum drinking age certainly fits within the broad concept of the general welfare, and the statute is entirely unambiguous. I am also willing to assume, arguendo, that the 21st Amendment does not constitute an independent constitutional bar. But the Court's application of the requirement that the condition imposed be reasonably related to the purpose for which the funds are expended is cursory and unconvincing. We have repeatedly said that Congress may condition grants under the spending power only in ways reasonably related to the purpose of the federal program. citing to Ivanhoe Irrigation District v. McCracken, 1958, holding the United States may impose reasonable conditions relevant to federal interest in the project and to the overall objectives thereof. Citing also Stewart Machine Company v. Davis. We do not say that a tax is valid when imposed by act of Congress, if it is laid upon the condition that a state may escape its operation through the adoption of a statute unrelated in subject matter to activities fairly within the scope of national policy and power. In my view, establishment of a minimum drinking age of 21 is not sufficiently related to interstate highway construction to justify so conditioning funds appropriated for that purpose. In support of its contrary conclusion, the court relies on a supposed concession by counsel for South Dakota that the state has never contended that the congressional action was unrelated to a national concern in the absence of the 21st Amendment. In the absence of the 21st Amendment, however, there is a strong argument that Congress may regulate the conditions under which liquor is sold under the commerce power, just as it regulates the sale of many other commodities that are in or affect interstate commerce. The fact that the 21st Amendment is crucial to the state's argument does not, therefore, amount to a concession that the condition imposed by Section 158 is reasonably related to highway construction. The court also relies on a portion of the argument transcript in support of its claim that South Dakota conceded the reasonable relationship point. But counsel's statements there are best ambiguous. Counsel essentially said no more than that he was not prepared to argue the reasonable relationship question discussed at length in the brief for the National Conference of State Legislatures. Aside from these concessions by counsel, the court asserts the reasonableness of the relationship between the supposed purpose of the expenditure, safe interstate travel, and the drinking age condition. The court reasons that Congress wishes that the roads it builds may be used safely, that drunken drivers threaten highway safety, and that young people are more likely to drive while under the influence of alcohol under existing law than would be the case if there were a uniform national drinking age of 21. It hardly needs saying, however, that if the purpose of Section 158 is to deter drunken driving, it is far too over and under-inclusive. It is over-inclusive because it stops teenagers from drinking even when they are not about to drive on interstate highways. It is under-inclusive because teenagers pose only a small part of the drunken driving problem in this nation. When Congress appropriates money to build a highway, it is entitled to insist that the highway be a safe one. But it is not entitled to insist as a condition of the use of highway funds that the state impose or change regulations in other areas of the state's social and economic life because of an attenuated or tangential relationship to highway use or safety. Indeed, if the rule were otherwise, the Congress could effectively regulate almost any area of a state's social, political, or economic life on the theory that use of the interstate transportation system is somehow enhanced. If, for example, the United States were to condition highway monies upon moving the state capital, I suppose it might argue that interstate transportation is facilitated by locating local governments in places easily accessible to interstate highways. Or conversely, that highways might become overburdened if they had to carry traffic to and from the state capital. In my mind, such a relationship is hardly more attenuated than the one which the court finds supports Section 158. There is a clear place at which the court can draw the line between permissible and impermissible conditions on federal grants. It is the line identified in the brief for National Conference of State Legislatures. Congress has the power to spend for the general welfare. It has the power to legislate only for delegated purposes. The appropriate inquiry, then, is whether the spending requirement or prohibition is a condition on a grant or whether it is regulation. The difference turns on whether the requirement specifies in some way how the money should be spent, so that Congress's intent in making the grant will be effectuated. Congress has no power under the spending clause to impose requirements on a grant that go beyond specifying how the money should be spent. A requirement that is not such a specification is not a condition, but a regulation, which is valid only if it falls within one of Congress's delegated regulatory powers. This approach harks back to United States v. Butler, 1936, the last case in which this court struck down an act of Congress as beyond the authority granted by the spending clause. There, the court wrote that there is an obvious difference between a statute stating the conditions upon which monies shall be expended and one effective only upon assumption of a contractual obligation to submit to a regulation which otherwise could not be enforced. The Butler court saw the Agricultural Adjustment Act for what it was, an exercise of regulatory, not spending, power. The error in Butler was not the court's conclusion that the act was essentially regulatory, but rather its crabbed view of the extent of Congress's regulatory power under the Commerce Clause. The Agricultural Adjustment Act was regulatory, but it was regulation that today would likely be considered within Congress's commerce power. While Butler's authority is questionable insofar as it assumes that Congress has no regulatory power over farm production, its discussion of the spending power and its description of both the power's breadth and its limitations remain sound. The court's decision in Butler also properly recognizes the gravity of the task of appropriately limiting the spending power. If the spending power is to be limited only by Congress's notion of the general welfare, the reality, given the vast financial resources of the federal government, is that the spending clause gives power to Congress to tear down the barriers, to invade the state's jurisdiction, and to become a parliament of the whole people, subject to no restrictions save such as are self-imposed. This, of course, as Butler held, was not the framers' plan, and it is not the meaning of the spending clause. Our later cases are consistent with the notion that under the spending power, the Congress may only condition grants in ways that can fairly be said to be related to the expenditure of federal funds. For example, in Oklahoma v. CSC 1947, the court upheld application of the Hatch Act to a member of the Oklahoma State Highway Commission who was employed in connection with an activity financed in part by loans and grants from a federal agency. This condition is appropriately viewed as a condition relating to how federal monies were to be expended. Other conditions that have been upheld by the court may be viewed as independently justified under some regulatory power of Congress. Thus, in Fulilove v. Klutznick, 1980, the court upheld a condition on federal grants that 10% of the money to be set aside for contracts with minority business enterprises. But the court found that the condition could be justified as a valid regulation under the Commerce Power and Section 5 of the 14th Amendment. This case, however, falls into neither class. As discussed above, a condition that a state will raise its drinking age to 21 cannot fairly be said to be reasonably related to the expenditure of funds for highway construction. The only possible connection, highway safety, has nothing to do with how the funds Congress has appropriated are expended. Rather than a condition determining how federal highway money shall be expended, it is a regulation determining who shall be able to drink liquor. As such, it is not justified by the spending power. Of the other possible sources of congressional authority for regulating the sale of liquor, only the Commerce Power comes to mind. But in my view, the regulation of the age of the purchasers of liquor, just as the regulation of the price at which liquor may be sold, falls squarely within the scope of those powers reserved to the states by the 21st Amendment. The history of the amendment strongly supports Justice Black's view that the 21st Amendment was intended to return absolute control of the liquor trade to the states, and that the federal government could not use its Commerce Clause powers to interfere in any manner with the states' exercise of the power conferred by the amendment. Accordingly, Congress simply lacks power under the Commerce Clause to displace state regulation of this kind. The immense size and power of the government of the United States ought not obscure its fundamental character. It remains a government of enumerated powers. Because 23 U.S.C. Section 158 cannot be justified as an exercise of any power delegated to the Congress, it is not authorized by the Constitution. The court errs in holding it to be the law of the land, and I respectfully dissent. For more audio cases, visit us at laudioforlisteners.com, follow us on Instagram and Facebook, and subscribe to our YouTube page.